Good afternoon in the YouTube room here. Beautiful Puebla, Mexico, home of the Red Ink International Institute, which is soon to open in downtown Puebla. And I'm looking forward to hosting indigenous artists from all over to commune and cooperate and enlist our indigenous philosophies and ideals to make a better space and place in the world, to understand that culture is our prevention to the tyranny, to the violence of nation state political action that is focused on punishing those that are not like them as far as class, color, and consciousness. It's a horrible time, and we don't need to mince words. A lot of you have been asking about or being troubled about how the administration of the ultra-right wing around the world, not just the United States, but right-wing, we shouldn't even say right-wing, fascist, bigoted organizations that are hell-bent on not only oppressing people, but violently enacting their judgments upon people, which often means exile, execution, and genocide. And these are not human values, nor are they political values when you look at it. There is no politic when you kill the other side. There is no politic, especially when you understand that there are no sides. There's only other human beings, other communities. And if a person is unable to relate to another community or person without objectification and without an exercise of domination and violence, make no mistake, that is not politics. That is oppression. That is the enaction of violence. And there's no place for that within our human spectrum. We simply cannot afford to live that way. The reason why we can't live that way is because it doesn't afford for all parties. And it's that simple. And I think that's where people get confused when we say all parties instead of all persons, all humans, all living beings. And yeah, that is where true politic focuses, is when the unity of not only human beings, but community, land, space, culture, and consciousness, and to unify those together are one of the most brilliant aspects of what we can do as human beings. And proof in the pudding is looking at the greatest cultures on earth and the art that they have endowed with us, and many of those cultures, especially indigenous cultures, still exist. And on that wonderful note, there's your short teaching between political and spiritual. So a spiritual being, a spiritual leader, isn't necessarily a pacifist. Although they believe in peace, although a good leader constantly practices for peace. Within the realities of what we're dealing with today, there are some, again, that are not here for politics. They're here for violence, bigotry, and to exercise their hate, their simple wants to execute and exile others. And again, what a marvelous example of humanity and a human being that we have in Ruben Snake, your humble serpent. He was an amazing spiritual leader and human being. And he also believed in defending himself and in defending his family and defending his community. As do I. And I always will. And I always believe in defending those who can't defend themselves. So, why don't we read the most marvelous chapter today? Chapter 10, Harassment and Surveillance. I think it has some poignance to this day and age. From the time I became involved with the American Indian movement up until 1974, when we moved to Sioux City, my family and I were subjected to a lot of FBI surveillance because of my involvement with the movement. I was regarded as a militant Indian who had organized a lot of demonstrations. I had been involved in a number of Indian movement confrontations over various human and civil rights issues. And here in Nebraska, I had organized the boycott of Walt Hill. We had organized public demonstrations against discriminatory law enforcement practices. We had demonstrated against the Bureau of Indian Affairs for their failure to meet our housing needs. We had demonstrated against the Catholic Church for unfair labor practices because they were hiring a construction firm that paid white college students more than they did Indian workers. Because I had participated for years in confrontations and because I was considered a militant and a radical, the FBI evidently considered me a threat to the American system. I was under constant surveillance. Whether I traveled, I could always recognize 2 FBI agents who were assigned to me. I never had been charged with breaking any law. We had confrontations with various law enforcement people in different situations, but nobody had ever arrested me and charged me with anything illegal. Yet I wasn't terribly surprised when I noticed FBI agents following me. I knew that most of the AIM leadership was under constant surveillance. I was somewhat irritated because they came to my home and talked to me. They began to harass my family when I was absent. It was an unpleasant situation for me and my family. There were many other AIM leaders who were subjected to the same kind of surveillance. Until that point in my life, I had believed the Federal Bureau of Investigation was a real, upstanding, straight-arrow organization. I came to realize that they were operating on the same rather shady principles themselves, especially in their handling of the kind of situations that we were confronting. They didn't support our cause to any great extent. One response to all the civil disturbance was being generated by black people and other ethnic minorities in the 60s and 70s was the creation of a distinct unit within the Federal Bureau of Investigation called Community Relations or Community Service. FBI agents with particular ethnic backgrounds were used as mediators or negotiators with so-called dissident element of our society. Some of these agents to be pretty good guys. We developed a relationship with one of the FBI community relations officers in the Kansas City office. He was pretty responsive to us. He tried to take seriously the issues we explained to him. In that respect, we had an impact on the agency. They created a special unit to demonstrate more sensitivity to what was happening. There were actually 2 occupations of Mount Rushmore. The first occurred in the fall of 1970. I was involved with that one. Then, about 2 years later, the movement came back and occupied the mountain again. But the first occupation of Mount Rushmore was the major occupation. I organized an event to honor the survivors of the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. My grandmother on my mother's side was half French and half Sioux from the Rosebud Reservation. So I have a real affinity and real kinship with the Sioux people. When I moved to Rapid City, I tried to learn something about that side of my family. In the process of doing that, I was made aware that there were 13 living survivors of the Wounded Knee massacre. I talked with some people about it, and I told them, we really ought to honor these 13 survivors of the Wounded Knee Massacre because it's a very important historical event in the life of Indian people. Some of the Sioux relatives agreed with that, so we began to organize a major honoring ceremony for the 13 survivors. This was in 1970, 80 years after the massacre. All these survivors had been little children during the massacre. Now they were all elders. We managed to bring 11 of the 13 survivors to Rapid City from wherever they lived. We celebrated this occasion during the Christmas holidays because that's when the massacre occurred. We had a big dance with several drum groups and lots of elders present. We had a big feast with a big giveaway honoring the 11 survivors of Wounded Knee. Really strengthened our identity as Indian people, particularly the Sioux people. That was done at one of the busiest times of my life. I was constantly into one activity or another. With the Community Action Agency in Rapid City, I worked as an assistant director under the executive director. My responsibility was training, reporting, and planning. I spent a lot of time working on community development projects with the Sioux people in the city. We were organizing around health issues and jobs, issues in housing. It was a real full-time job for me, the year that I worked in Rapid City. I came back to South Dakota to Nebraska to work for the Nebraska Intertribal Development Corporation. I left Nebraska for Albuquerque in August of 1972. After my mother passed away, I lived in Albuquerque until July of 1974. During my years in Albuquerque, I made 80 field trips to 27 different states. I was also involved in the AIM activity. I came to know virtually every Indian leader in the nation and developed personal friendships with many outstanding Indian leaders from around the country. During this time, I was becoming more committed to the Native American Church. Since giving up drinking in 1965, I had been looking for spiritual fulfillment. I couldn't find it in Mormonism, so I was coming back to the Native American Church, and I began attending meetings more regularly during the early 1970s. My renewed interest was also influenced by my older brother, who was slowly dying of scleroderma. He had contracted this disease after the Second World War. We used to go to prayer meetings so that he could use medicine and feel better. Anyway, little by little, I was being drawn back to the Native American Church. I had designed a program and won a contract with the Department of Education for the establishment of a program with Sioux City, Iowa American Indian Center, and the Indian Center's board of directors invited me to come and run the program. They said, "You designed this program the way that we told you to do it. We feel that you're capable of running it in the way that we want you to run it. We'd like you to come and work for us." I resigned my job in Albuquerque and moved my family back to Sioux City, 20 miles north of the Winnebago Reservation. We settled down in Sioux City in July of 1974, and I began to manage the educational program for the Sioux City American Indian Center. When I took the position, I told them that I would give them 3 years of my life. I told them that I would try to build their center into something meaningful. At the time I was employed by them, they had a director and a part-time secretary and operated on a budget of about $30,000 a year. When I came on board, we had a $100,000 federal education contract, and I set about designing and developing other programs for the Indian Center. Within that 3-year time period I had committed myself to, we grew to a staff of 17 people with over $250,000 in funding. There was an intense effort by the FBI to buy me out or to get me to be an informant during the Wounded Knee occupation. Some agents came to my house and said, "Mr. Snake, we realize that you're involved with the movement, but we also understand that you're not a promoter of armed confrontation." Pay attention, guys. "So we're here to ask you for the support and your help." I told them that I couldn't do anything for them because, as the chairman of the American Indian Movement, I was still obliged to support the efforts of the people in the movement and what they were doing. Sometime afterward, a couple of guys came knocking on my door, professing to be the former Vietnam soldiers. One of them, who was in a wheelchair, said he was an Indian. They claimed they wanted to help out at Wounded Knee in whatever way they could. They also asked me to get them into Wounded Knee. They were willing to run guns. Of course, I was suspicious of them because they didn't appear to be genuine activists. I had been around the movement long enough to recognize most of the people in the movement, to know the activist type of people. I thanked them for their offer of help. Then I told them that I'd be contacting them, and I sent them away, but I never did call them. This type of activity led me and my family to know that we were under constant surveillance. They were trying to find a way to use us to get at the people in Wounded Knee. When the occupation at Wounded Knee took place, we were still living in Albuquerque. I was working to train Indian educators. Most of the FBI harassment of my family took place in Albuquerque. Although the harassment stopped, the surveillance didn't. After Wounded Knee, there were still FBI people that followed me around to my public speaking engagements. I was one of many young Indian activists who got invited to colleges, universities to talk about these issues. I used to travel extensively to different parts of the country to deliver the message of the movement. I was aware that there were some FBI people around. They stopped harassing me, but they were still there. There were some pretty strong allegations of corrupt tribal government made by Russell Means and other AIM leaders. I understand that they were attempting to expose the corruptness of the Oglala Sioux tribal government and trying to force the federal government to have greater respect for the traditional leadership of American Indian tribes. The standard practice of the non-Indian system had been to ignore traditional tribal leaders and to handpick tribal leaders who were willing to work with the white man. So the governmental systems were designed and implemented on reservations. Tribal councils patterned after the white American model of democratic government were created. As a result, most of the traditional democratic tribal government processes and the traditional tribal leaders were totally ignored. That caused a rather serious problem in a lot of Indian communities, where there was still a very strong traditional element. They looked at the system and noticed that the people in control of their system, the tribal government, were the beneficiaries of all the federal money. The tribal government people hired their friends and relatives and set up programs they felt were necessary. They spent the money the way they wanted to, with very little, if any, involvement of traditional people. This became a bone of contention. A lot of traditional people used to say, "What good are all these programs? They sure don't help us out. We have to change the government to make it be more responsive to us." These are the kind of actions that led up to the Wounded Knee occupation of 1973. Not too long after the occupation of Wounded Knee by the American Indian movement had begun, Richard Wilson, the chairman of the Oglala Sioux tribe, invited the executive officers of the National Congress of American Indians and the National Tribal Chairmen's Association to his reservation for a joint meeting to help him determine what should be done about the situation at Wounded Knee. Most of the executive officers of the two national Indian organizations came to Pine Ridge. He wanted them to discuss how he should respond to the threat of armed insurrection on his reservation. That meeting was convened at Villamus Hall in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. It just so happened that the chairman of my tribe of the Winnebago of Nebraska was appointed to be the chairman of this meeting. My brother was the vice chairman of the Winnebago tribe. So he called me in Albuquerque and said, "Brother, it might be worthwhile for you to come over here and try to talk to these people, because if this gets out of hand and both of these national organizations are supportive of Dickie Wilson, there might be a lot of violence and unnecessary deaths at Wounded Knee." See, we even have to negotiate those who capitulate and those who know what it means to defend the people. But let's go on. Maybe you could come over here and try and help them find some reasonable solution. I promised I would try and do that. My wife and I flew to Rapid City, and we were picked up by one of our Sioux relatives who drove us down to Pine Ridge. On the way there, he said, "Don't expect me to hang around outside because I'm considered an AIM supporter. If they see me, they're sure to try and hunt me. I'll drive by occasionally to see if you're done. When I see you're outside, then I'll know it's time to pick you up and leave." He dropped us off at Vilmus Hall, where this large gathering was taking place. We met our tribal chairman, my brother, my sister, who was on the tribal council, and some other Winnebagos. One of those Winnebagos was Dickie Wilson's mother-in-law. She was really happy to see all of us. During the coffee break, she got Dickie Wilson to come over and sit down with us. He was right in the middle of the Winnebago delegation, laughing and talking to us when he had our pictures taken. I was sitting right next to him, of course. He didn't realize who I was. That's when the chairman of the American Indian Movement got up and went about his business. Then we got in line for lunch. While we were standing in line for lunch, a lady who I recognized as the editor of the Ogallala newspaper came up and asked me, "Aren't you Ruben Snake?" I replied, "Yes, madame." She continued, "Are you involved in the American Indian Movement? Aren't you one of the leaders?" I said, "Yes, madame, I am." Then she demanded to know what I was doing at the gathering and why I wasn't out at Wounded Knee. I explained to her that I had come with the hope of being able to address the people present, that I wanted to help them find some way to resolve the situation without anybody being hurt. She didn't receive that idea too well. As we continued walking through the lunch line, she went and informed Mr. Wilson, one of the AIM leaders, was present. She referred to me. While we were sitting down to eat our lunch, some of Mr. Wilson's so-called goons came over and demanded that I come down out of the stands where I was sitting. They wanted to pick a fight. Let's get it on. Let's have it over and done with here and now. I told them that I wasn't here looking for trouble. I wasn't there to pick a fight. I was there to try and devise some solution to the problem without anybody being hurt. They declared, "You're not welcome here. You better leave." I stated, "The chairman of this gathering is my tribal chairman. If he tells me to leave, I'll leave." They went over to Dickie Wilson, and I told him who I was and what I had said. He sent word back that he didn't want me there. So my wife and I decided it was time to leave. As we got up to leave, members of the goon squad, both men and women, began lining up at the door, forming a gauntlet. They all started saying, "Let's kill these no-good sons of bitches." These were the kind of threats we heard as we left the hall. Several of them began moving towards their cars, as assumed that they were going to get their guns. There was no place for us to go, so my Sioux friend wasn't waiting for us. We were in a rather precarious situation. Suddenly, around the corner came the Winnebago tribal van with my sister driving and my brother sitting next to her. They came to a screeching halt beside my wife and urged us to get in. We jumped in and we peeled out of there. As we were racing down the highway, they said, "We're going to get you out of town before something bad happens to you." We were leaving Pine Ridge as fast as we could when we saw one of my Sioux friends coming down the road. We signaled him and he turned around in the middle of the road and followed us. We stopped, jumped out, and threw our bags into his car. Then we sped away. My sister and brother led the Wilson's goons off a different route so that they wouldn't chase us. There were cars coming along to look for us, but we managed to get out of Pine Ridge without anything happening. That was the most serious incident in which we were involved during the confrontation at Wounded Knee. It could have been more serious, but we managed to get out of there before anything terrible happened. There were numerous deaths on the Pine Ridge Reservation before and after Wounded Knee occupation. A lot of people died mysteriously, yet nobody ever charged with anything. There were probably 60 people killed on that reservation within only a year or two. It was truly a tragic situation. A great deal of public animosity was generated by the publicity surrounding the deaths of 2 FBI agents. That publicity only strengthened the negative image people already had of Indians. But they would say, look at those Indians are doing. But nobody ever addressed the fact that some 60 Indian people had been killed and nobody ever had been brought to justice. The FBI turned a blind eye towards that. There may have been some financial motive involved in this dispute, but it was primarily a power struggle between the established Indian Reorganization Act tribal government and the traditional people. The traditional people were struggling to gain greater access to the tribal government. There are huge mineral deposits in the Pine Ridge Reservation that could be used by various industries. There was probably some fear that if the tribal council lost control, that if the traditional people got more politically involved, they would stop the development and exploration of the various mineral deposits in order to preserve the land. Although it wasn't publicized, it seems likely that corporate America wanted to have unrestricted access to the minerals. The injustices of the system that we were living in then still exist today. The media, being what it is, never picked up on the message that we were trying to deliver. When the confrontation occurred at Wounded Knee, they looked at the superficial aspects of what was happening, the spectacle of the confrontation. They focused on the challenge to the system. They wrote about the confrontation. They didn't write about the problems that we were talking about. When we talked about the idea of Raymond Yellow Thunder, they didn't pay much attention. They focused the attention on the Indian occupying the town of Gordon, Nebraska. We were at Mount Rushmore to establish the fact that the Black Hills had been stolen. No money has ever been paid for the Black Hills, but the media never brought that message to the American public. Instead, they just said, here are all these militant young Indians occupying the sacred shrine of democracy. The media never did respond adequately to what we were saying. That being the situation all along, because the media is the white man's institution. All the reporters, all the journalists, all the editors, all the producers are non-Indians. They inevitably tell the story from their point of view, not the Indians' perspective. This alternative news source, publications such as Mother Earth News, did a pretty good job of reporting what was happening. The mainstream media totally ignored what we were trying to say and played up those most sensational aspects of what we were doing. Man, what an incredible chapter to reflect on. What an incredible chapter to reflect on again as what is happening now. I mean, just those last few lines about the media never did respond adequately to what we were saying. That had been the situation all along. That's because the media and it is a white man's institutions. All the reporters, all the journalists, all the editors, and all the producers are all non-Indians. Wow! Think of that as far as our media, and think of it today as far as our universities, our museums, our institutions of art in the United States. Wow! With DEI gone, now there is less and less of a voice that represents us in totality as Americans. And this is the kind of bigotry and fascism that is not a memorial for someone's life. And that person was no political free speech hero. And that person, whatever their name is, because mark my word, with such evil existing, the name may wander for a few generations, but that person will be forgotten long before any of us with a genuine heart, connected to a genuine mind, that knows that it is our collectivity and humanity that is divine. Our names will last in memorial. And so I really hope you enjoyed chapter 10 of Ruben Snake, Your Humble Serpent, and reflecting on what it means to be spiritual and also hold your ground in self-defense of your community and those who can't defend themselves. And I'll see you soon for chapter 11 of Ruben Snake, Your Humble Serpent. This is Henry Quintero and the Red Ink Institute, and I sure hope you enjoyed the story.